Thank you. It's a real privilege to be here. I'd like to begin by talking about how to counter extremist violence. White supremacist violence has been rising in America in recent years. In fact, data from the FBI and watchdog groups like the ADL clearly document this disturbing trend. But white nationalism is now also a fast-growing global threat. These groups have spent decades building alliances with their counterparts overseas, developing a sophisticated online presence. White nationalists also distribute print and electronic propaganda and produce high-quality recruitment videos. The white supremacist movement has definitely evolved since I was in it in the 1980s and early 1990s. Back then, we were very visible, with shaved heads, black boots, and tattoos, and we recruited in person through playgrounds, skate parks, and music concerts. But over time, the strategy unfolded to present a more sanitized hate movement to the mainstream. Members started dressing to blend in instead of to intimidate, and they began taking jobs in places like law enforcement, joining the military, and enrolling in universities where it was easier to recruit young people. Hate movement leaders have learned how to draw in disillusioned young people whose only medium for acceptance might be the virtual world, and whose shared frustrations may stem from a real world that they perceive has sidelined them. Recruiters now also use influence tactics like internet memes and elaborate conspiracy theories to target people in vulnerable communities, like multiplayer online video games, internet forums dedicated to depression and autism, and in smartphone apps primarily used by young people. Our repeated failure to understand the white supremacist movement of today as a violence-driven global movement, rather than a fringe problem, has prevented us from developing a clear strategy to effectively combat it. Keeping people safe from extremism requires a strategy that redefines the threats we face. It must be a balanced, non-political, non-partisan, and non-discriminatory approach that recognizes violent extremism and violent white nationalism as part of the global terror threat. But neutralizing violence is only half of the equation. Preventing radicalization in future generations is also critical. This must happen through policy reforms and a public health approach that supports legitimate initiatives that offer preventative services for people who might be vulnerable to hate narratives. This is how we defeat hate in the long term. This is how we defeat hate now. I also want to hear from you, so let's take some questions from the field.
What is causing the sudden growth of hate and violence around the world?
Great question. Racism and violence have always been around in some form, but social media has really made it more visible and provides some anonymity to people who want to spread hate. Uncertainty fuels extremism, and fear rhetoric, conspiracy theories, and polarizing language online, and from those in power drive that uncertainty. We're now dealing with uncertainty on a scale none of us have seen before. The pandemic, unemployment, businesses closing, death, protests, and a very high-tension election that's coming up here in the United States. And we're dealing with disinformation flow at a scale we've never seen before. We're all looking for answers. And unfortunately, there are too many, and not all of them true, out there for us to latch onto. Let's take one more question.
What can someone do if they know someone, a family member or a friend, who is mixed up in hate?
That's another great question. In my experience as both a former extremist and someone who has worked to help hundreds of people disengage from extremism, I've learned that it is most often not really about the actual ideology that draws people in, but rather a wayward search for a sense of identity, community, and purpose. So instead of trying to argue with someone about their views or shame them, it's best to try to listen and learn more about the motivations behind their words or actions. What might have happened in their life that motivated them to take a detour toward hate? What quote-unquote potholes, as I call them, did they stumble into? Could be things like the loss of a parent, abuse, being bullied, mental health, or even a drug addiction, Some examples that might have made them, especially vulnerable to manipulation. Look for nonpartisan human common ground with the person, and if you see there are areas you can help leverage resources for them, and where they're maybe needed, you can provide those. As potholes are filled with more positive things, a different sense of purpose can be found, and a change in ideology is more likely to follow.